The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., but David was already awake. He had been tossing and turning all night, thinking about the big presentation waiting for him in Chicago. This business trip would either make or break his chances for the promotion he'd been chasing for 2 years. But there was something even more important on his mind. His 8-year-old daughter Lily was coming with him. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. His ex-wife was meant to take care of Lily while he traveled, but she had called 3 days ago with a family emergency. David's mother was too frail to watch an energetic child for a whole weekend, and his sister lived across the country. That left him with only one choice: bring Lily along and drop her off at his brother's house in Chicago while he handled his business meetings. Lily had never been on a plane before. When David told her about the trip, her eyes lit up like Christmas morning. She spent the entire week asking questions about flying, clouds, and whether she could touch the sky from the window. David had splurged on a window seat for her, even though money was tight. Seeing her excitement made every penny worth it. The morning rush was chaos. David burned the toast, spilled coffee on his shirt, and realized he'd forgotten to pack Lily's favorite stuffed animal. Meanwhile, Lily bounced around the house like a rubber ball, chattering nonstop about the adventure ahead. She had packed and repacked her small backpack 3 times, making sure she had coloring books, snacks, and her tablet for the flight. Traffic to the airport was worse than David had expected. Construction on the highway turned what should have been a 30-minute drive into an hour-long nightmare. He watched the clock on his dashboard with growing anxiety, calculating and recalculating whether they'd make their flight. Lily didn't notice his stress. She was too busy pointing out every airplane in the sky, asking if that was the one they'd be riding. At the airport, the security line stretched forever. David's stress levels shot through the roof as he watched families with small children get pulled aside for additional screening. When their turn came, Lily forgot to take off her light-up sneakers, setting off the metal detector. The security officer was patient, but precious minutes ticked away as they sorted everything out. By the time they reached their gate, boarding had already begun. David's heart sank when he heard them calling for passengers in rows 20 through 30. He quickly checked his boarding passes. They were in row 12. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The gate agent announced that the flight was completely full, and they were looking for volunteers to check carry-on bags. Lily pressed her nose against the window, watching the big silver plane outside. "Is that ours, Daddy?" she whispered, her voice full of wonder. David nodded, trying to push down his anxiety about the tight schedule. He had exactly 45 minutes between landing and his first meeting. Every minute counted. When they finally boarded, David felt like he was swimming upstream against a river of passengers. Everyone seemed to be moving in slow motion, struggling with oversized bags and taking forever to find their seats. Lily held his hand tightly, her head swiveling back and forth as she took in every detail of the airplane's interior. The aisle was packed with people shoving luggage into overhead bins. David carried their small bag in one hand and guided Lily with the other, counting row numbers as they moved deeper into the plane. Row 8, row 9, row 10. The crowd was getting thicker and people were getting impatient. Someone behind them sighed loudly when Lily stopped to stare at the tiny airplane bathroom. Row 11, row 12. David's eyes found their row and his heart stopped. A woman was sitting in what he was absolutely certain was Lily's window seat. She was well-dressed, reading something on her phone, looking completely comfortable and settled in. David felt his blood pressure rising. After everything they'd been through this morning, after promising Lily her first window seat experience, someone had taken their spot. He looked down at Lily, who was craning her neck to see around the passengers in front of them. Her face fell when she spotted the woman in the window seat. "Daddy, is that lady in my seat?" she asked quietly, her excitement dimming like a candle in the wind. David's jaw tightened. He'd paid extra for that window seat specifically for Lily. He'd planned this whole trip around giving her a magical first-flight experience. The woman looked comfortable, like she belonged there, but David was certain she was wrong. He pulled out his boarding passes to double-check, though he was confident about their seat assignments. The line of passengers behind them was getting restless. Someone coughed impatiently, and David could feel the pressure building. Lily tugged on his sleeve, looking up at him with confused eyes. She didn't understand why they weren't sitting down, why her special window seat was occupied by someone else. David took a deep breath and made a decision. He'd been pushed around enough today by traffic, by security delays, by the general chaos of air travel. He wasn't going to let his daughter's first flight experience be ruined by someone who couldn't read a boarding pass properly. It was time to set things straight. The woman in the window seat looked peaceful and unbothered, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit her. David squared his shoulders and prepared to approach her. Behind him, Lily fidgeted with her backpack straps, still staring at the seat she'd been dreaming about all week. This was supposed to be a simple flight to Chicago. David had no idea he was about to make a mistake that would change everything, not just for him and Lily, but for the woman sitting calmly by the window, reading her phone and minding her own business. The stage was set for a confrontation that nobody on that plane would ever forget. David stepped forward, his frustration from the entire morning finally boiling over. The woman in the window seat looked up from her phone as his shadow fell across her. She had kind eyes and an intelligent face, but David was too worked up to notice. All he could see was someone sitting in his daughter's seat, threatening to ruin what was supposed to be a special day. "Excuse me," David said, his voice carrying more edge than he intended. "I think you're in the wrong seat." The woman looked surprised but remained calm. "I'm sorry," she replied politely, setting down her phone. "Is there a problem?" "Yes, there's a problem," David continued, his tone getting sharper. "You're sitting in my daughter's seat. She's 8 years old and this is her first time flying. I specifically booked her the window seat." Lily stood behind her father, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. She could sense the tension in his voice and didn't like it. Other passengers were starting to stare, and she felt her cheeks getting hot with embarrassment. The woman remained perfectly composed. "I understand your concern," she said gently. "Could I perhaps see your boarding passes? I'd be happy to check my seat assignment against yours." But David was already past the point of polite discussion. The stress of the morning, the traffic, the security delays, and now this. It all crashed together in his mind. "I don't need to show you anything," he said firmly. "You need to move now." The woman blinked, clearly taken aback by his aggressive tone. "Sir, I really think there might be some confusion here. If you could just show me your boarding pass, we could clear this up in seconds." "There's no confusion," David shot back. "You're in seat 12A, which belongs to my daughter. I paid extra for that window seat, and she's been looking forward to this flight all week." The passengers around them were now openly watching the confrontation. An elderly man in the aisle seat across from them frowned at David's tone. A businesswoman 2 rows up turned around to see what the commotion was about. The atmosphere in the cabin was shifting from the usual pre-flight chatter to uncomfortable silence. Lily tugged on her father's jacket. "Daddy," she whispered, "maybe we should just sit somewhere else." But David was too far gone to listen to his daughter's wisdom. "No, sweetheart," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You shouldn't have to give up your seat because someone can't read their boarding pass properly." The woman in the window seat took a deep breath. She reached into her purse and pulled out her boarding pass, holding it up for David to see. "Sir, my boarding pass clearly shows seat 12A. Perhaps if you showed me yours, we could figure out where the mix-up is." David glanced at the boarding pass she was holding but didn't really look at it. His mind was made up. "I don't care what your boarding pass says," he declared. "My daughter deserves that seat more than you do. She's just a kid, and this is supposed to be special for her." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly at his words. For the first time, a flicker of something, maybe annoyance, maybe disappointment, crossed her face. "I see," she said quietly. An older woman sitting in the middle seat of their row spoke up. "Maybe I could help sort this out," she offered kindly. "I've seen plenty of seat mix-ups over the years." "There's nothing to sort out," David insisted. "This lady just needs to find her actual seat and stop taking up time. We're already running late, and my daughter has been looking forward to sitting by the window." The woman in the disputed seat looked at Lily with genuine sympathy. "You must be very excited about your first flight," she said warmly to the little girl. Lily nodded shyly, but her excitement had faded. She was mortified by her father's behavior and just wanted the whole situation to disappear. "It's okay," she mumbled. "I don't have to sit by the window." "Yes, you do," David said firmly. "You absolutely do, because that's the seat I paid for." He turned back to the woman. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to move. My daughter comes first here." The woman studied David's face for a long moment. Something in her expression suggested she was used to this kind of treatment, though it clearly still stung. "I understand you want what's best for your daughter," she said carefully. But I really am in my assigned seat. That's impossible, David snapped. I specifically requested 12A when I booked our tickets weeks ago. By now, the entire section of the plane was watching the drama unfold. Some passengers looked uncomfortable with David's aggressive tone. Others were checking their own boarding passes, wondering if they might be sitting in the wrong seats too. The boarding process had essentially stopped as everyone focused on the confrontation. A flight attendant at the front of the plane noticed the disturbance and started making her way down the aisle. David saw her coming and felt vindicated. Finally, someone with authority would sort this mess out and get his daughter into her rightful seat. There's a flight attendant coming, he told the woman. She'll straighten this out real quick. The woman nodded calmly. I hope so, she agreed. I'd like to get this resolved as much as you would. Lily wished she could disappear into the floor. Her father was making such a scene and everyone was staring at them. This wasn't how she'd imagined her first airplane experience at all. She'd pictured looking out the window at clouds and cities below, not standing in the aisle while her dad argued with a stranger. The flight attendant was getting closer, squeezing past passengers who were still trying to stow their luggage. David straightened his shoulders, preparing to explain the situation. He was absolutely certain he was right, and once the flight attendant saw their boarding passes, this woman would have to find her real seat. What David couldn't see from his angle was the small, satisfied smile that flickered across the woman's face as she watched the flight attendant approach. It wasn't a mean smile or a vengeful one. It was the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where they belonged and was about to prove it. The stage was set for the next act of this drama, and David had no idea he was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. The flight attendant approached with the practiced calm of someone who dealt with countless passenger disputes over her 15-year career. Her name tag read Maria, and her warm smile remained steady despite the obvious tension radiating from row 12. She could see the situation from 50 feet away: an agitated man, an uncomfortable child, and a composed woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Good morning, folks, Maria said pleasantly as she reached their row. I couldn't help but notice there seems to be some confusion about seating. How can I help sort this out? David immediately launched into his explanation, his voice carrying that special tone parents use when they're fighting for their children. This woman is sitting in my daughter's seat, he began, gesturing toward Lily. I specifically booked 12A for her because this is her first flight, and I wanted her to have the window seat experience. Maria nodded thoughtfully, her expression neutral and professional. I understand how important that is, she said, glancing down at Lily with a genuine smile. First flights are very special. Exactly, David continued, encouraged by her response. I paid extra for that window seat weeks ago. I have our boarding passes right here. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, pulling out the crumpled papers. The woman in the disputed seat remained quiet, but Maria noticed how she sat with perfect posture, her hands folded calmly in her lap. There was something about her demeanor that suggested she was used to handling difficult situations with grace. And what's your side of the story? Maria asked the woman politely. I'm simply sitting in my assigned seat, the woman replied evenly. I have my boarding pass here as well, and I'd be happy to show it to you. David jumped in before she could continue. She keeps saying that, but she won't move. Look, I don't want to make this a bigger deal than it needs to be, but my daughter has been looking forward to this all week. She's never flown before, and I promised her the window seat. Maria could see that other passengers were getting restless. The boarding process had essentially stopped, and people were craning their necks to see what was happening. Some looked sympathetic to David's plight, while others seemed uncomfortable with his increasingly demanding tone. I completely understand your concern for your daughter, Maria said diplomatically. Let's take a look at everyone's boarding passes and get this sorted out quickly. David handed over his documents first, his confidence apparent. He'd checked these passes multiple times over the past week, showing Lily where they'd be sitting and pointing out her special window seat. There was no way he was wrong about this. Maria examined David's boarding passes carefully, her trained eye immediately spotting the relevant information. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite a frown, but definitely a moment of realization. She looked up at David, then at the row numbers above the seats, then back at the boarding passes, sir, she said gently. I see here that you and your daughter are actually assigned to seats 14B and 14C. David's confidence faltered for just a moment. "That's impossible," he said quickly. "I specifically requested 12A. Check again." Maria showed him the boarding pass, pointing to the seat numbers clearly printed on the document. "Row 14, seats B and C. The window seat in row 14 would be 14A, but that's assigned to someone else." David stared at the boarding pass like it had personally betrayed him. The numbers seemed to swim before his eyes. 14B, 14C, not 12A. Not the window seat he'd promised Lily. Not the special experience he'd planned for her first flight. "But I paid extra," he said weakly, his voice losing its aggressive edge. "I specifically asked for a window seat for my daughter." The woman in seat 12A finally spoke up, her voice gentle but clear. "Perhaps there was a miscommunication when you booked your tickets," she suggested kindly. David's face was turning red, but now it was from embarrassment rather than anger. Lily tugged on his sleeve again, sensing the shift in the situation. "It's okay, Daddy," she whispered. "I don't need the window seat." But Maria wasn't finished yet. She turned to the woman in 12A with professional courtesy. "And could I see your boarding pass as well, just to complete our check?" The woman smiled and handed over her document without hesitation. Maria glanced at it and nodded. "Seat 12A, just as you said." David felt like the floor was dropping out from under him. Not only had he been wrong about their seat assignment, but he'd spent the last 10 minutes aggressively confronting an innocent woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I don't understand," he mumbled, looking at his boarding passes again. "I could have sworn." Maria noticed that other passengers were still watching, and she knew she needed to resolve this situation quickly. The plane was full and they were already behind schedule, but she also saw an opportunity to turn this embarrassing moment into something positive. "It happens more often than you'd think," she said diplomatically. "Seat numbers can be confusing, especially when you're stressed about travel." The woman in 12A looked at Lily, who was staring at the floor in embarrassment. The little girl's excitement about flying had completely evaporated, replaced by the mortification that only children can feel when their parents make a scene in public. "You know what?" the woman said suddenly, her voice warm and thoughtful. "I have an idea." David looked up, expecting another lecture about reading boarding passes correctly. Instead, he saw genuine kindness in the woman's eyes. "I fly quite often for work," she continued, "but I remember my very first flight when I was about your daughter's age. It was magical." She paused, looking directly at Lily. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lily," the little girl replied quietly, finally looking up from the floor. "What a beautiful name," the woman said. "Lily, I was thinking, I do a lot of work on flights anyway, mostly reading and reviewing documents. I don't really need to look out the window. Would you like to trade seats with me?" David's mouth fell open. After everything he'd put this woman through, the accusations, the demands, the public confrontation, she was offering to give up her seat for his daughter. Maria smiled, recognizing the gesture for what it was. "That's very kind of you," she said to the woman. "Are you sure you don't mind?" "Not at all," the woman replied, already gathering her belongings. "Everyone deserves to have their first flight be special." But Maria held up a hand. "Actually, before we make any changes, there's something else I should mention." Her tone suggested there was more to this story, something that would make David's mistake even more significant. The woman in 12A met Maria's eyes and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head, as if to say, "Please don't." But Maria had already decided that this moment called for a different kind of lesson. Maria paused, looking between David and the woman in seat 12A. The cabin had grown unusually quiet, with nearby passengers leaning in slightly to hear what would come next. There was something in Maria's expression that suggested this situation was about to take an unexpected turn. "Before we make any seating arrangements," Maria said carefully, "I think there's something important everyone should know." She turned to address not just David and Lily, but the passengers within earshot who had been watching the drama unfold. The woman in 12A looked slightly uncomfortable, shaking her head subtly at Maria. "Really, it's not necessary," she said quietly, but Maria had made up her mind. In her 15 years as a flight attendant, she'd seen too many situations like this one, and she believed this moment called for education rather than simple problem-solving. "This lovely lady," Maria announced, gesturing towards seat 12A, "is Dr. Amelia Washington. She's one of the most respected pediatric surgeons in the country. David felt his stomach drop. A doctor? He'd been aggressively confronting a doctor, demanding that she give up her seat. Maria continued, her voice carrying throughout the section. Dr. Washington is flying to Chicago today because she's receiving the National Medical Association's Humanitarian Award for her volunteer work providing free surgery to children in underserved communities. The words hit David like a physical blow. Not only had he been completely wrong about the seat assignments, not only had he made a scene and embarrassed his daughter, but he'd been bullying someone who dedicated her life to helping children like Lily. Dr. Washington shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Maria, please," she said softly. "This really isn't necessary." But the revelation had already spread through the nearby rows like ripples in a pond. Passengers were looking at David with a mixture of disapproval and secondhand embarrassment. The elderly man across the aisle shook his head slowly. A businesswoman 2 rows up whispered something to her seatmate while glancing in David's direction. Furthermore, Maria continued, clearly committed to making her point, Dr. Washington specifically requested a window seat today because she's flying to receive this award in honor of her late mentor, who always told her to keep looking forward and upward. She wanted to spend the flight reflecting on her journey and the people who helped her get where she is. Lily looked up at her father with wide eyes, beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. David felt like he was shrinking into himself, wishing he could disappear entirely. Dr. Washington finally stood up, her dignity intact despite the uncomfortable attention. "Mr. She paused, realizing she didn't know David's name. "Thompson," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "David Thompson." "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Washington said gently, "I understand you wanted to give your daughter a special experience. That's what good fathers do." She looked down at Lily with genuine warmth. "And Lily, I meant what I said about trading seats. Your first flight should be magical." David wanted to crawl under the nearest seat. Here was this incredible woman, someone who had achieved more than he could ever dream of, someone who spent her life helping children, and she was being kind to him after he'd treated her terribly. "I can't let you do that," David said, his voice thick with shame. "After how I acted, after what I said. I'm so sorry, Dr. Washington, I don't know what came over me." Dr. Washington studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there. "We all have stressful days," she said diplomatically. "Travel can bring out the worst in people sometimes." Maria watched the exchange with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of teaching moment she'd hoped for. "Actually," she said, "I might have a solution that works for everyone." She pulled out her phone and quickly sent a text to her colleague at the front of the plane. Within moments, another flight attendant appeared, having worked her way back through the cabin. "Jessica," Maria said to her colleague, "do we still have those 2 seats available in first class?" Jessica nodded. "We do." The upgrade list was short today. Maria turned to Dr. Washington with a smile. "Doctor, would you accept a complimentary upgrade to first class? It's the least we can do for someone who's being honored for their service to children." Dr. Washington looked surprised. "That's very generous, but I couldn't." "Please," Maria insisted. "You'll have a window seat up there too, and much more space to prepare for your ceremony." Several passengers nearby began to applaud quietly, showing their approval of the gesture. The elderly man across the aisle nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Dr. Washington smiled gracefully. "In that case, I accept. Thank you." As she gathered her belongings, she turned back to Lily. "And this means you can have the window seat here in 12A, just like your father wanted." Lily looked up at her with wonder. "Really? But what about your special flight?" Dr. Washington knelt down to Lily's eye level. "You know what makes flights really special? It's not just looking out the window. It's remembering to be kind to the people around you. Can you promise me you'll remember that?" Lily nodded solemnly. "I promise." David watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and crushing embarrassment. "Dr. Washington," he said, "I don't know how to apologize enough for how I acted." She stood and looked at him directly. "The best apology is making sure this doesn't happen again. Not just with seating arrangements, but with how you treat people when you're stressed or frustrated." "You're absolutely right," David said, his voice sincere. "Lily deserves to see better from me." Dr. Washington nodded and began moving toward the front of the plane, escorted by Jessica. As she passed other passengers, several reached out to shake her hand or offer congratulations on her award. Maria turned back to David and Lily. "Why don't you two get settled in your seats now? Lily, you can sit in 12A, and Mr. Thompson, you'll be right next to her in 12B. As they settled into their new seats, Lily pressed her face to the window with renewed excitement. But David noticed she kept glancing back toward the front of the plane where Dr. Washington had disappeared. "Daddy," Lily said thoughtfully, "that lady was really nice. Even though you were mean to her." David felt his heart break a little. "Yes, she was. And you're right. I was mean to her, and that was wrong. Why were you so angry?" Lily asked with the innocent directness that only children possess. David considered his answer carefully. This was a moment that would stick with his daughter forever, and he wanted to make sure she learned the right lesson from his mistake. David looked out the window as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, gathering his thoughts before answering his daughter's question. The morning sun was casting long shadows across the tarmac, and he could see Dr. Washington through the gap between seats, settling into her first-class seat with the same grace she'd shown throughout their entire encounter. "I was angry because I was scared," David finally said, choosing his words carefully. "I was scared that your first flight wouldn't be perfect, and I was scared that I'd disappoint you. But being scared doesn't give anyone the right to be mean to other people." Lily considered this, pressing her small hand against the airplane window. "But she wasn't trying to make my flight bad. She was just sitting where she was supposed to sit." The simple wisdom of an 8-year-old hit David harder than any lecture could have. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. She didn't do anything wrong. I made assumptions about her and I was rude and unfair." As the plane lifted off, Lily's excitement returned in full force. She watched the world shrink below them, pointing out cars that looked like toys and houses that looked like dollhouses. But even in her wonder, she kept thinking about Dr. Washington. "Daddy, what's a humanitarian award?" she asked as they climbed above the clouds. David explained how some people dedicate their lives to helping others, especially those who don't have much money or access to good medical care. He told her about doctors who volunteer their time to perform surgeries for free, who travel to places where children might not otherwise get the help they need. "So she helps kids like me?" Lily asked. "Kids exactly like you," David confirmed. "And I treated her badly when I should have been thanking her for the good work she does." The flight attendant, Maria, stopped by their row during the beverage service. "How are you two doing?" she asked warmly. "The view is amazing," Lily said, then looked up at Maria seriously. "Thank you for helping Dr. Washington get a better seat." Maria smiled. "She deserved it, and I'm glad you're enjoying your window seat." After Maria moved on, David found himself thinking about all the assumptions he'd made that morning. He'd seen a woman in their seat and immediately decided she was in the wrong. He'd raised his voice and made demands without even checking his own boarding passes first. Worse, he'd done it all in front of Lily, teaching her by example that it was okay to treat people poorly when you don't get what you want. About halfway through the flight, something unexpected happened. Dr. Washington appeared in the aisle next to their row. "Having walked back from first class, I hope I'm not interrupting," she said gently. "I wanted to check on Lily and see how she was enjoying her first flight." Lily's face lit up. "It's so cool. I can see everything. Are those real clouds?" Dr. Washington laughed. "They are real clouds. Pretty amazing, isn't it?" She sat down in the empty middle seat for a moment. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier, and I wanted to share something with you both." David braced himself, expecting a well-deserved lecture about his behavior. Instead, Dr. Washington looked directly at Lily. "When I was your age, I wanted to be a pilot. I thought flying was the most magical thing in the world. But when I told people about my dream, some of them said little girls like me couldn't become pilots." "That's not fair," Lily said indignantly. "You're right, it wasn't fair. But you know what I learned? Sometimes people say mean things or make wrong assumptions because they're scared or frustrated. Just like your daddy was this morning. The important thing is not to let other people's fears stop you from chasing your dreams." David felt tears prick his eyes. Here was this remarkable woman using his own terrible behavior as a teaching moment for his daughter. "I didn't become a pilot," Dr. Washington continued. "But I found something even better. I became a doctor, and now I get to help children feel better and achieve their own dreams." "Did people still say mean things to you?" Lily asked. Dr. Washington nodded. "Sometimes they did. But I learned that the best response to meanness is kindness. When people are cruel, it usually says more about them than it does about you. David couldn't stay quiet any longer. Dr. Washington, I need to say something. What I did this morning was inexcusable. I made assumptions about you. I was aggressive and rude, and I did it all in front of my daughter. You had every right to be angry with me, but instead, you've shown us both what real grace looks like. Dr. Washington turned to face him fully. Mr. Thompson, I've been in situations like this before, more often than I care to count actually, but I've learned that holding on to anger only hurts me. What matters is that you recognize your mistake and do better next time. I will, David said earnestly. I promise you that, she smiled. And I can see that you're a good father who loves his daughter very much. You just had a moment where stress got the better of you. We all have those moments. Before returning to her seat, Dr. Washington pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. She handed it to Lily. This has my hospital's information on it. If you ever decide you want to be a doctor like me, you can write to me. I'll be happy to tell you all about it. Lily clutched the card like it was made of gold. Thank you. Maybe I will be a doctor. Or maybe a pilot. Or maybe both. Dr. Washington laughed. I like the way you think. Dream big, Lily. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, David reflected on everything that had happened. He'd started the day focused on giving Lily a perfect experience, but instead, he'd nearly ruined it with his own poor behavior. It was Dr. Washington's kindness and grace that had saved the day and turned his mistake into a valuable lesson. Daddy, Lily said as they watched the city grow larger below them, when we get home, can we write a letter to the airline about Dr. Washington? What do you want to say? David asked. That she's really nice and that she made my first flight special even though you were grumpy. David laughed despite himself. Even though I was grumpy? Yes, we can definitely write that letter. As they landed, David realized that this flight had indeed been perfect for Lily, not because everything went according to plan, but because she'd witnessed firsthand what it meant to respond to difficulty with grace and kindness. Dr. Washington had given them both a gift far more valuable than any window. Sight the lesson would stay with them both forever. Assumptions can be dangerous. Kindness is always the better choice, and sometimes the people we judge too quickly turn out to be exactly the kind of people we should hope to become.